And let's kick off this afternoon's session with panel 7, imaginary versus reality. So what is imagined ADM+S to be versus what it really looks like in reality? We have 3 papers in this panel. 2 papers will be presented live, with the third one is a recorded presentation. So we will first start with Jian and Terry Flu. And Jian is a senior lecturer of media communication at Deakin University, and Terry is a distinguished professor of media communication from Sydney University. So it's their collaborative work on governing the algorithmic distribution of news in China, the case of Jinri Toutiao. Okay, the floor is yours, Jian. And Terry. Oh.
Yeah, thank you, Haiqing, and thanks to the ADM+S and RMIT for organising this event. And also I'd like to just give a thank you to James Meese, who was here earlier, who's co-edited book, The Algorithmic Distribution of News, this chapter appears in. I'll just make some very quick remarks and then hand over to Jian. I just want to pick up on 4 things. The first is around the growing conceptual and practical significance, the concept of governance, that this literature, which has its roots in the new institutionalism and the work that people like March and Olsen were doing in the 1980s, talking about how to break down the state and society dichotomy to understand how regulatory fields and decision-making practices within and between organisations were increasingly coming to be a patchwork of institutional and governmental forms, and acknowledge the growing significance of that work to media and communication scholarship and to digital scholarship. At the same time, and obviously one of the important practical implications of that has been this shift within governing practices that I won't necessarily say it's a global phenomenon, but it's certainly happening in a lot of jurisdictions, this shift from command and control regulation to more informal modes of shaping decision-making. And so here we're talking about the rise of behavioural economics, nudge theory, and so on, and the relationship this has to what in the political science literature is sometimes referred to as a governance revolution. Now, the interesting thing about introducing the concept of governance with regards to digital platforms is that digital platforms are always already governed. That governance, I would argue, is as fundamental to a digital platform being a digital platform as interfaces, data, and so on, that because of the multi-sided nature of the markets in which they work and indeed the multiple stakeholders with which platforms interact. And I think it's no coincidence that the concept of stakeholder capitalism has arisen to prompt, which is an idea that actually goes back to the 1960s and people like John Kenneth Galbraith, but it's risen to prominence in recent years in ways that I would say are very much tied up with the rise of digital platforms to ascendancy in particularly in US capitalism. So we've got this question going on about the relationship between private and public governance, or governance of platforms, and governance by platforms. And obviously algorithmic governance can sit in within a subset of this. Now, the final point to make there is that we need to go beyond buzzwords. Okay, everyone's talking governance. Xi Jinping's book is The Governance of China. Everyone's talking governance. But what's the difference between governance practices within platforms, governance practices that are based around partnerships or some kind of co-governance, and regulation as such? So just as an aside, I'd note that I'm a little bit unfashionable at the moment in that I've become a late adherent to the ideas of Jürgen Habermas at precisely the moment where Habermas is now largely deemed to be irrelevant for reasons related to technology. But I think as soon as one starts to consider normative criteria around digital platforms, for example, what can and cannot be said on a platform, the terrain on which this debate occurs is I would suggest still actually deeply Habermasian. And there's some opening remarks to pass over to Jian and
Thank you, Haiqing, and thank you, Terry, for opening our presentation. In this paper, we study how algorithm-based news aggregation applications in China are governed using Toutiao as a case study. We will then adopt a new institutionalism approach, more specifically, the notion of path dependency. Terry just talked about our theoretical approach on understanding the governance of algorithmic news in China. We will adopt that notion to critically understand the politics of governing algorithmic distribution of news in China. The implementation of algorithms in China's news industry started in 2012 when news aggregation applications such as Jinri Toutiao, Tiantian Kuaibao, ADM+S started their service by using machine learning techniques and algorithmic models to generate tailored feed list of content for their subscribers. Following the trend, top commercial news portal sites such as Tengxun, Xinlang, Sohu, Wangyi, Fenghang Xinwen, and so on, also applied the algorithmic model in their newsfeed service. Launched by ByteDance, which also owns TikTok in 2012, Toutiao is China's most popular news aggregation application. It has more than 120 million daily active users. It has more than 1.1 million accounts, including self-media accounts, accounts operated by media organization, government organization, and other kind of organizations. In December 2016, the founder and former CEO of ByteDance, Zhang Yiming, accepted an interview with Caijing magazine. In the interview, Zhang Yiming said, Toutiao is not a media organization. It doesn't want to educate its clients as other traditional media outline. Zhang Yiming insisted that Toutiao should only take corporate responsibilities as a technology company rather than a media company. Zhang Yiming's comment, which defends Toutiao's algorithmic neutrality, very soon caused a debate on if algorithms need an editor-in-chief in China. The CCP's mouthpiece, People's Daily, led the debate and published 6 commentaries in 2017 and 18 to criticize Toutiao and its algorithmic model. This also kicked off China's regulation and governance of the algorithmic distribution of news. So in this paper, by conducting document analysis and policy analysis, we categorized the regulation and governance of Toutiao model into 3 levels. At the state level, the Cyberspace Administration of China updated provisions for the administration of Internet News Information Service, firstly released in 2005. The revised provisions require news aggregation applications to obtain license. They must have dedicated news editors, content reviewers, and technical maintenance staff in order to obtain a license to operate. The license needs to be reviewed and renewed every 3 years. The online news providers have to accept supervision and inspection by the CAC and their local cyberspace administration office. In addition, from 2017 to 19, Toutiao have been called in for meeting. In Chinese, we say 约谈 by relevant administrative organizations 7 times in total to discuss its problems, study policies and regulations, and solve the identified problems within a given time frame. 约谈 is a form of governance with the Chinese characteristics through which a higher administrative organizations, usually the supervisory organ, rectifies misbehaviors of the organizations under its administration and supervision. During the period, Toutiao was also fined a few times for spreading erotic information and false advertising. So in the meantime, other popular news aggregation applications were also governed and regulated in a similar way, mainly through 约谈 and penalty. At the corporate level, Toutiao had to make a number of changes under the tightening control from the government. To name a few, Toutiao first changed its slogan from what you care for is a headline to information creates value. So this means Toutiao has abandoned the algorithmic neutrality it advocated earlier and started to take social responsibility as a media organization, not just as a technology company. Toutiao also enhanced human interventions into algorithmic distribution of content, such as expanding its content review team to 10,000 people, and CCP members are preferred in recruitment. And Toutiao also established the expert panel to help supervise content, improve AI, facilitate filtering and censorship. Moreover, Toutiao also enhanced its collaboration with the state media to help promote the CCP agenda. For example, it set up a new channel called 新时代, New Era. This channel reprints and distributes political news from the state media, and is set as the default for all Toutiao users. At the third level, the state media also quickly responded to the rise of algorithmic distribution of news. In June 2018, People's Daily launched its first news aggregator called 人民号. The initiative aims to demonstrate what an algorithmic model with CCP value should look like to compete with the Toutiao model and to guide China's AI-driven news aggregation in a politically correct direction. So the state media's active competition with the commercial news aggregation applications and occupation of the new propaganda battlefield can be seen as an alternative way for the Chinese government to guide and govern the algorithmic news in China. The governing campaign on the algorithmic distribution of news from 2016 to 2018 led to the release of the provisions on the governance of the online ecosystem. Article 12 under Chapter 3 in the provisions stipulates what content types should be encouraged and prohibited for online content service platforms that use algorithms to distribute information. Since 2020, we found news coverage about Yuetan with news aggregators and penalty of news aggregators dramatically declined comparing with in the past few years. This means the algorithmic distribution of news has been basically tamed by the Chinese Communist Party after the governing campaign. Okay, next I will pass the time to Terry again to talk about how to use a path dependency approach to understand the politics of such governance.
Thanks. As we can see from the example, the path-dependent nature of governance in China with regards to media and information transcends the sort of distinctions between media and information that came to be central to how digital platform companies came to be understood as neutral platform intermediaries in the 1990s. So this requires us to be clear that when looking at any particular media system or digital system, we need to be attuned to the continuity and impact of what's happened in the past and how that shapes current institutions and policies. So in the case of Toutiao, the claim, that would be a fairly standard claim for a Google or a Facebook, which is to say we're actually, neutral with regards to the content, couldn't survive the sort of governance frameworks which underpin its operations within China. So as is noted in this literature by people like Douglas North, Oliver Williamson and others, is that even in periods of rapid transformation, the legacies of the past continue to act as institutional constraints. And here the key institutional constraints relate to such concepts as public opinion guidance and stability maintenance, which continued, the practices associated with them continue to evolve over time. And so we see the People's Daily evolving in the digital space and so on. But the underlying frameworks informing those changes remain relatively constant. So the algorithmic distribution of news transformed traditional modalities of news production, distribution and consumption, and in such potentially posed a threat to the CCP's news and public opinion work. More explicitly, the decentralised and user-oriented algorithmic model, with or without limited intervention from human editors, can challenge the legitimacy and impact of centralised news production through state media. So government regulation of algorithmic news has served to minimise the potential challenge from news aggregator applications to ensure the leadership of party journalism and to guide public opinion in accordance with state messaging. Now, this, I think we can reflect on some of the ways in which this informs other conversations that are happening. So in the US at present, the Biden administration has taken a quite different approach to digital platforms of certainly a previous Democrat administrations of the Clinton and Obama stripe. And a pivotal question, and there are three different legal cases, and I should say it's not necessarily politically it's politically partisan, but it's not necessarily associated with one or other side, because one of the cases the US Supreme Court is hearing is around the rights of digital platforms to downgrade content from right-wing sources, essentially in the states of Texas and Florida. So from a few different directions, the underpinnings of Section 230 of the Communications Act are under challenge in the US, but nonetheless, the path dependency that's associated with those early decisions around the internet, I think we can expect will remain a significant constraint upon any moves by the Biden administration or other administrations to set new rules for the governance of digital platforms. By contrast, what we're seeing here is that what we might refer to as taming algorithms can become a political response on the part of the CCP in the news industry, whereby technology becomes a principal means through which power is distributed and exercised in contemporary society, as distinct from being a fundamental change agent to path-dependent forms of institutional governance. You in yeah, oh, sure. Great. Yep. Do you want to speak to it?
Yeah,
okay.
Do that. So I just want to quickly conclude our presentation. Which is also a part of the importance of our research. We think governing Toutiao marks the beginning of China's regulation of algorithm, platform, economy, and industry. If we look at the subsequent regulations of big data, swindling, and platform monopoly, as well as the recent implementation of the first law to regulate algorithm in 2020, the algorithm recommendation in Internet Information Service, they can be seen as CCP's continuous efforts in opening the black box of algorithm in China. And studying the regulation of algorithms in the online news industry first, as demonstrated in our case study, we illustrate that ideological and political implication of algorithmic application are the highest concern of the Chinese regulators. And we hope our study could shed light on the understanding of the policies, strategies, and politics of regulating algorithms in other fields in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Jian and Terry, for your work on the algorithmic regulation in the case of Jinri Toutiao. I'm sure lots of people have comments and questions concerning algorithmic manipulation and governance, or to use the subtitle of the next paper by Shan and Michael Keane, they're all watched over by machines of loving grace. But in your case, the machines might be the CCP machines. But what's the machine in Shan and Michael Keane's paper? Well, here you are.
Thank you, Haiqing, for making such a wonderful panel discussion possible. Also, thanks for Terry and Jian's wonderful presentation. Hello, everyone. I'm Shan. The title of our presentation today is called Automated Decision-Making in China, watched over by Machines of Loving Grace. It's a project conducted by my supervisor, Professor Michael Keane, and myself. Given its work in the progress, we would appreciate your suggestions and ideas. The original idea of this project evolved from my PhD study on the uptake of virtual reality technology in China. And the title of this project was inspired by a poem written by an American writer, Richard Deakin. In 1967, he penned a short poem called Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which has become synonymous with the perils of the information age and the counterculture movement in America. He imagined a cybernetic future where people would be free to do as they like, where machines will do the unpleasant and tedious work, hence the title. 2 years after this poem came out, Neil Armstrong worked on the moon. Then in 1971, the Santa Clara Valley in California was renamed the Silicon Valley. As Fred Turner has detailed, the Californian ideology was born in such a historical background, which is a blend of can-do optimism and libertarianism. What happened over 50 years ago has relevance to our topic today, given it was a time when popular culture caught up with science. Robots and AI were appearing in TV shows and movies. An animated children's cartoon called Xuesen was hugely popular in Western countries, introducing a myriad of improbable ideas that would later become innovations. In the same year, however, the people living in China were forced to endure a decade of political chaos called cultural revolutions. Instead of prosperous society with the what the social movement brought to China was class struggle, poverty, and hunger. Ironically, the story of cultural revolution is the beginning of the most influential Chinese science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem, written by Chinese author Liu Cixin. Though he was born in 1963, which was a turbulent age in China, he believes he belongs to a lucky generation. He said, "No generation is like us, who have been able to witness such tremendous changes in the world around us. And this reality provides fertile soil for the growth of science fiction in China." In this presentation, we examine how such a Californian techno-utopianism is perceived by China, given the techno-utopian future envisioned by the pioneers of Silicon Valley to some degree resonates with the Chinese vision of the future. Despite the fact that creative work is being challenged by software programs like ChatGPT, therefore, in this presentation, we ask, what does the rise of Chinese science fiction indicate about the future trend of the automated decision-making society in China? We choose to use social imaginary as the theoretical framework in this project. It is mainly inspired by a book of essay called China Imagined, From European Fantasy to Spectacular Power, in which the Paris-based scholar Gregory Lee draws on the concept of social imaginaries to differentiate the way that China sees itself and how people in the Western countries imagined China. By social imaginary, it refers to the ways people imagine their social existence and how they fit together with others and how things go on between them and their fellows. We don't have time to delve into this theoretical framework too much. However, we would love to explain more in Q&A session if necessary. To illustrate how we respond to the research question, we will first recount how science fiction came to China. Then we will take a couple of themes from the recent film Wandering Earth to explain how Chinese science fiction resonates with the Chinese national agenda. At last, we will use the concept of imaginaries to show how the Chinese creative mind is employed to indicate the future of ADM+S in China. Chinese science fiction started in the late Qing dynasty. In 1902, the reformer Liang Qichao installed a type of philosophical science fiction in the magazine New Fiction. After that, many Chinese people started to read overseas science fiction. For example, in 1903, Lu Xun translated Jules Verne's Round the Moon into Chinese. It was not until 1904 that the first homegrown science fiction emerged in China, titled Tales of the Lunar Colony. Although Chinese intellectuals such as Lao She had already borrowed the form of science fiction literature to express their struggling feelings about the social and political conflict in Chinese society, Science fiction was mostly seen as a type of literature for children between the 1940s and 1960s in China. With the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, science fiction ground to a halt. Science fiction was criticized by influential Chinese scientists such as Xuesen. In their view, science fiction is a bad thing, as science is rigorous, whereas the fantasy ideas expressed in science fiction did not adhere to scientific norms. Such criticism led to the science fiction being classified as spiritual pollution by Deng Xiaoping's government in 1983. The restriction on Chinese science fiction was subsequently lifted, but the Chinese national enthusiasm for homegrown science fiction was not rekindled until the appearance of the novel, The Three-Body Problem, in 2008. The success of Three-Body Problem is distinctive from the popularity of other recent Chinese cultural productions, such as Wolf Warriors, Jian, which are only popular in the Chinese market. The IP of Three-Body Problem, however, has been purchased by Netflix and Tencent Videos. It alternatively showcases how Chinese people use a creative mind to practice the political thought of Xi Jinping, tell China's story well, and deliver China's voice well. 讲好中国故事，传播好中国声音。The Chinese science fiction movies, The Wandering Earth, is adapted from Liu Cixin's another science fiction work. It tells how a Chinese astronaut, Liu Peiqiang, together with other astronauts from different nations, strive to migrate the Earth out of the solar system to avoid the threats of the aging sun and save all human beings on the Earth. Based on the story of Wandering Earth, we found some interesting differences and similarities between Chinese and Western science fiction in terms of the logic of storytellings. For example, when mankind is faced with a survival crisis, the story settings of Western science fiction is mostly to escape from the Earth and seek to find another space to survive, like other planets or other spaces. However, the sighting of the Wandering Earth, just on the well-known Chinese mythology, the foolish old man removes the mountains. In the movie, Earth is seen as the only home to mankind. Therefore, choosing to bring rather than abandon Earth reflects Chinese cultural virtues of loyalty and willpower. There is another typical characteristics of some Western science fiction, which is exploration and colonization. Some Chinese scholars believe that it is closely related to the Western history, which is filled with outward aggression and colonization. However, this type of storytelling is difficult for China to imitate, especially after Xi Jinping proposed the concept of building a community of shared future for mankind, 建立人类命运共同体. This reflects the characteristics of Chinese science fiction movies that is using the community of shared future as a basic social imaginary to advance Xi's political views, that is peaceful rise of China and exchanges with other nations and life forms. However, we also find some similarities between the Western and Chinese science fiction narratives. For example, in West science fiction, the common human society is usually very highly intelligent and digitized. However, this type of future is also highly hierarchical, which is defined by the hobbyists of science fiction hobbyists as cyberpunk, meaning high technology and low life. In Wandering Earth, the movie vividly describes a similar scene, like the normal people living on the surface of the earth must pass certain types of selection before they can enter the relatively safe underground world. And the other people who didn't pass the selection, they have to stay on the surface of the earth and waiting for death. Far from a positive energy, such a highly hierarchical society for a socialist country like China is obviously very pessimistic. It reminds us to rethink the relationship between people and technology. More important, what and who exactly is technological progress serving? To whom are ADM technology a benefit? Therefore, we argue that Chinese science fiction as a type of political propaganda contributes to the national campaign, such as telling China's story well and building a community of shared future. However, as a type of call for national transformation, it fails to provide a clear roadmap for normal people, especially the people living in the low-class society, how socialism with Chinese characteristics supports them to enjoy living with machines of loving grace. Chinese science fiction presents a social imaginary in which technology is dominated by social elites in the high class. I will stop here by suggesting that considering the question, who is the biggest beneficiary of building an automated decision-making society, is as important, if not more, as the question like how such technologies will help human and social progress. Thank you. This is all for my today. And I think Michael could join later about the discussion.
It's
session.
online. Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting, you know, when Adam started this morning's presentation, he took us backwards into the future. And now today we're throwing you all backwards and forwards. We just went to the future and now we're doing backward. We're going to go backward again. The next one is a recorded presentation by Gianluigi Negro. He's an associate professor in Chinese studies at the University of Siena. He was planning to come in person. That's why I put him in this panel. Originally I was going to put with your panel, Adam, but you know, it didn't work out. But then he couldn't come. So he's recorded his presentation and he's with us in spirit today. Okay, can we play his recording, please?
Hello, everyone. First, let me to thank Professor Haiqing for her kind invitation to record my presentation. It's actually a great pity I couldn't join you today. This very fantastic, very unique academic event. What I'm trying to do in the coming 10 minutes is to present my preliminary research on the state of the metaverse in China and the role of Qian Xuesen to nationalize the idea of the metaverse itself. Well, the metaverse in China, it can be considered quite utopic, especially last year and in 2021. 2021 was included in one of the most searched topic by Baidu. But this is not, the general interest is not limited to the Chinese internet users. Actually, this trend was mainly driven by the Mark Zuckerberg decision to rebrand its company to Meta, from Facebook to Meta. This happened on October 2021. The decision from Facebook to invest on the metaverse was mainly driven by the fact to provide more emphasis on segments such as virtual reality and artificial intelligence. But historically speaking, the term metaverse was already started to circulate already in the 90s, thanks to a novel titled Stone Crash, which was published on 1992 and written by Neil Stephenson. Coming back to China, the general interest on the metaverse was confirmed, especially by the economic interest. Indeed, by the end of 2021, there were roughly 1,500 mainland Chinese companies that applied for trademarks related to the concept of metaverse. But Chinese state-affiliated institutions have not shared the same enthusiasm of the private sector. State-funded think tanks have decried metaverse as a national security risk, and the national IP regulator even blocked metaverse-related trademarks. Nevertheless, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, including the metaverse in a list of types of innovative small and medium-sized enterprise to support companies working on blockchain, artificial intelligence, and so on. There was even in 2021 a white paper published by the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, which is a state-run think tank affiliated with the Ministry of State Security, on which metaverse was considered a kind of pivot and facilitator phenomenon to boost artificial intelligence projects focused on artificial intelligence, blockchain, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and cloud storage, 5Gs, and so on. But what is interesting to note is that beside the very important investments by software companies such as Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, but also hardware companies such as Huawei, Xiaomi, at the broader level, or even in a Western environment, they're still missing the official definition of the metaverse. And this is particularly clear on two articles, one published by Wired, the other published by Forbes, on which there is basically a debate. The article on Forbes highlight the fact that there are more than 20 different definitions of metaverse. So in other terms, there is a lack of consensus, at least from the theoretical level, on the metaverse. And this lack of consensus might be the Chinese role might be quite interesting. Before going to describe in detail, let me just highlight the most important figure in this process, who is one of the most famous Chinese scientists named Xuesen, who has published a lot on different international academic magazines, and was very famous, a kind of national hero, basically, because not only because of his previous experience on MIT, the US, but also especially because he contributed to lead the Chinese nuclear weapon, which eventually became the atomic bomb. Was involved in other very important scientific national projects such as Dongfang ballistic missile space programs, and probably the most important project is the Chubon-1 satellite. His very active contribution to the Chinese science led Xuesen to be popular, also because of different media initiatives. First of all, it was including the Central Committee of Chinese Communist Party, but also there were several TV programs, documentaries produced by the CCTV to highlight his discoveries and scientific activity. On 2011, there was also a movie that was released and in his honor, directed by the director Jian. And lastly, but still important, there was a body of official and unofficial literature which basically celebrate this national figure. Coming back to the role of the metaverse, well, there is an association that is China Mobile Communication Association Metaverse Consistent Circles. That's the way how it's named. And behind this project, there is China Mobile Communication Federation and several Chinese scholars, and also a kind of official support. Namely, Mr. Wu Mangguo, the previous vice premier of the State Council, approved this project, this China Mobile Communication Association on Metaverse, and supported its own initiative. What is interesting by this initiative is the role of Xuesen, and it is a kind of recollection and publication of previous letters shared by the Chinese scientists to his own colleagues. According to studies of this association, Shan published the exchange of letters on which it described his idea of the metaverse even before 1992. In particular, there was a letter written by Xuesen to his colleague Wang Chan on November 1919, on which he highlight the role of virtual reality. He referred to some new expressions such as Renwei Jinri, man-made landscape, or even better, the Lingqing, also called fairyland. Fairyland, this general idea of fairyland was eventually highlighted by another letter published on July 1993, on which Professor Qian highlighted how this idea of virtual reality would have an impact on the society. According to the Chinese scientists, there was the ability, this new fairyland, this Lingqiang, the ability to greatly expand the perception of human brain, allowing users to enter in a still unexplored world. For this reason, Xuesen is considered kind of the father of the metaverse, and not only in China, but at the worldwide level. So there are other letters, but what I would like to highlight here is the historical figure of Xuesen and its relation to Chinese society and metaverse in general. Its role is important for at least 4 reasons. The first one, because it's in line with China National Defense Program and the Qian past experience. If in the past was more related to the scientific program, now it's we can frame it as kind of national ideology and narration defense. The second reason why the experience, the rebranding, the role of Xuesen is still important in relation to the metaverse is the role, its relationship with the party and the well-articulated commitment to the state ideology. This is, of course, a quite emergent role, or a re-emergent, if you prefer, role of anti-Americanism in this specific historical moment, which is very important also in the narration of the metaverse. And lastly, is partly updated policy towards intellectuals, which somehow confirm a form of continuity to the past, even in very particular area of Xi Jinping. So I think my time is over. I just want to thank again Professor Haiqing, and I hope we have other chances to discuss my paper in detail. Wish you a very nice conference. Bye.
Obviously, Gianluigi is still in his sound asleep, so we won't be able to ask him questions. But if you would like to, feel free to send the comments, questions to me or him directly. But we have two other papers here, and the authors are here. Michael is online, and feel free to grill them for about 10 minutes. If we finish early, we can have a bit morning tea break, afternoon tea. So I mean, before we come back to our symposium with Professor Xuesen Zhao. Okay, the floor is okay. We've got a question in the back.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the panel. I had a question for Terry and Jian. And something, Terry, you said about in passing about the the difference between governance and regulation. Governance and government, we might also say. And I was just curious if you would unpack this a bit more, in the kind of context, I assume, of how this figures in China, but also the way it also is not perhaps figuring to the extent that it is exclusive to China, of course. And then here I'm thinking in particular of the relation between governance and regulation. With the proliferation of the Internet of Things, 5G networks, the sort of smart grids, these various kind of technological forms, which of course necessarily adhere to global standards and protocols, and the way then questions around sovereignty and well, also infrastructural imperialism, I would say, start playing out on these terrains. I would just wonder if you could speak a bit more to that, maybe draw out some of the kind of contradictions, tensions, and so forth that you're seeing at work there.
Okay, can you hear me fine from this? Okay, I had the thanks very much, Ned, for the question. My book that was published in 2021 was called Regulating Platforms. Back in 2017, 2018, I spent a long time thinking about whether to call it Regulating Platforms or Governing Platforms. And if it were Governing Platforms, it would have been a different book. And I think that alerts us to, I think there's a risk in this literature that you say, well, regulation was the past and governance is the present. And from my own point of view, there's been a lot of working through of why that's not a sufficient argument, because the contemporary literature on regulation recognises regulation as far more than simply state set rules and actors follow them or experience sanctions for not doing so. It explicitly incorporates a lot of what we'd understand to be governance practices within a broadened remit of regulation. At the same time, when we think about what are the roots of the tech clash, they lie less in the specific cases and more in the sense that the platforms themselves could not be relied upon to address those issues in a systematic way through their internal governance practices, the continual promises to do better. So, and it does connect to sovereignty in a sense that I think there's about at least 100 new forms of regulation of digital platforms have emerged in the last 3 years throughout the world. And there is in some sense a reassertion of the primacy of the polity there around the governance practices of digital platforms. At the same time, we have, in the Chinese case, we have this sort of the classic Foucauldian question, if you like, of governing too much and governing too little. That the path dependency of the relationship, and I think it's no coincidence that it would be around news that it first emerges. This is the particular point of sensitivity in the media sphere for the CCP. That you have simultaneously an assertion of the authority of the state with regards to the emergent formations, and that the state will not be subordinated to algorithmic governance, while at the same time you have the traditional organs of the party moving into convergent media, and the two are interconnected. But what doesn't apply there is the distinction that there's this demarcation between media on the one hand and internet intermediaries on the other. Would you want to?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I just want to add one point from our empirical research on Jinri Toutiao. Actually, in our document and policy analysis, we collected regulatory policies. All these documents collected are actually regulations. But we think the purpose of issuing this kind of regulatory policies to regulate algorithmic news has a governance purpose, that is to control, guide the online public opinion for the purpose of public opinion, safety, or you can say stability maintenance in the online environment. Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you to the panelists. I also had a question for Professors Flu and Xu, which was sort of more on the side of the corporation, the algorithmic sort of in your case study, this one particular company, and sort of, because if we're thinking about path dependency or historical ways of maintaining social stability, which was sort of the theoretical backbone of the presentation, you know, there's also a history of those who are subject to regulation and subject to governance trying to find ways around the formal governance regulations. And, you know, this, you know, some people call it the cat and mouse game of, okay, you create new regulations. Well, I'm going to find the new loopholes in your regulations, or I'm going to try to find ways to sort of, you know, you create a red line and I'm going to see how close I can get to that red line without being, you know, punished or sanctioned. So I was wondering if you had any insights on the other side of that and sort of thinking about the response of the company. Currently in your narrative, it seems like they've just sort of acquiesced, or they have sort of said, okay, we're going to do what you want us to do. We're going to hire all these content moderators. We're going to sort of listen to the party. But I'm wondering if there's, you know, more in that response. Do you think they have an incentive to try and get around those new regulations, or is it simply not worth it anymore? So I was wondering if you had any insights on those who are receiving the new regulations or the new sort of governance tactics.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really interesting and important question. For our case study, we just focus on the time frame during the governing campaign. So that's why from the finding, you can mainly see that the algorithmic news companies, they are very cooperative to accommodate to the tightening regulation and control from the government. But as you said, this is a kind of mutually, evolutionary. On the one hand, the government updated its regulations according to the new phenomenon happening in the industry, but on the other side, the corporate part is also very adaptive and flexible. Yeah. I can give one example, like for Jinri Toutiao, during the governing campaign, because they receive a few yuan with the regulatory authorities, they have to temporarily close down some channels and remove some content. But after the intensive campaign period, they may have different kind of, similar content channel, but with a different name, and they can remove some very sensitive, like erotic or fake news content, but they still have something, I think, in the gray area to attract the users. But in the meantime, they also want to make themselves safe, so they play the edge ball to keep the balance. Yeah, I think that's quite common, not just for news aggregators, but also for short video sharing platforms, live streaming platforms, and other kind of, online platforms.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd also just note that we need to consider what I might call incumbent media as institutional actors in this space. And it's, if those who are based here in Australia recall the discussion around the News Media Bargaining Code in Australia 3 years ago. This was being drummed up in a very big way by News Corporation. Any content analysis of media over that period would draw attention to the central role that News Corporation played in bringing together a coalition of, let's say, incumbent media to do something about the threat of Google and Facebook to their business model. And in a situation where this is not linear, this is a non-linear phenomenon, that the monopoly that incumbent news media had is clearly gone, but incumbent news media aren't going anywhere. Facebook and Twitter may not be brands in existence by 2030, and the New York Times and the Washington Post will. And that's not where thinking was about 10 years ago on this subject, and to a very, and for a news aggregation platform and to social media to a significant degree, the news content of their platforms is the incumbent news media to a far greater degree than I think we acknowledged in sort of the heydays of citizen journalism and so on. So there's the role that if we take People's Daily as an example, plays as a company that feels under threat in this environment is something that also needs closer analysis.
Thanks, Terry. Next question.
Yes, I really enjoyed all the presentations on this panel, but given the time constraint, I'm only going to ask Xuesen and also Michael. I can see Michael there, all right? It will be a shame that we don't hear you say something. I think many people in this room, myself included, want to hear your voice, right? And so I read this science fictions as a hobby, so I don't really do research into it. I also used the All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace in my teaching. I sense there's a big contradiction. So I want you to elaborate more about your question mark, and especially like if we say, go back to the title of this panel is about one of the is the imagery, right? So the overall image from Liu Cixin, from all this is like, if we can use a very simplified way that Roger actually started, this yesterday morning, is to say like it's a Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. Okay, going back to that, the overall imaginary I would get is like Liu Cixin's work right? And it has many complicated, he's so productive. But then the overall imaginary is that we only need Mr. Science. We don't need Mr. Democracy, right? Mr. Democracy is misleading, okay? It's bad, all right? But then so it's a highly scientist. This morning we have a criticism of scientism, right? And without a human face. But then watched over by loving machines of loving grace is actually the very opposite. I would call it a naturalist. It's like we human beings and computers and mammals, our brothers and sisters, and maybe the forests, okay? We are all equals. So it's an extreme version to say, like science is just one way in this larger order of natural, okay, ecology, okay? The machines are it's not just computer, they're machines of ecology of like a natural world. So I would say it's an extreme way to say we need to have democracy with the animals, with the non-human entities, with the superhuman, like a naturalist. It's almost like Avatar. You also showed the First Nations people. Okay? So how can you? What exactly is your? And by the way, I love the Liu Cixin original, like Wandering Earth, the Chinese literature so much. I cannot stand the movie picture. Okay, which is completely a torture, okay, for people like me. And so can you tell us a little bit more exactly, like you are more focusing on the film part rather than the richer literary part, and how am I right to interpret your question mark as a signal of the Mr. Science vis-a-vis Mr. Democracy?
Well, let me have a go at this, Jack. When that poem was written in the 1967 by Brodigan, he was just a kind of a poet that was lauded by the hippies, and he didn't. I think he was just sort of. It was just amusing. It became something else over time. It became something that had deeper meaning. I think he was referring to the idea of something that is more all-embracing, as you say, but. By taking it forward, we're pushing it into the present time, where we are actually seeing these machines that are sort of making decisions for us, as we talked about. What the point of the paper is, I think, is that the kind of science fiction has been taken up by the government, by the party. And to answer another question at the same time that Maids asked, it wouldn't have. Online, it wouldn't have become such a big thing if it hadn't been validated by the Western, Liu Cixin's work hadn't been validated by Western critics by winning awards. It became well known. So it became a way for the party and for the fans to think about science fiction as a way of thinking about the future. And it's sort of fallen into the lap of the party propaganda machine, I think. To push forward the idea of science and progress, leaving out democracy, as you say. We don't need democracy because we've got the community of shared future, which doesn't really deal with democracy in any meaningful way. But we're talking about a kind of a China model, if you like. So science fiction is being used by the CCP to promote its way of thinking about the world and the future, a certain imaginary that is not the same imaginary that Richard Brodigan would have been thinking about in 1967. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think I'll better declare this panel ending, because I know you guys have lots of responses. And with Terry and Jian's responses, I actually have a lot to say as well, but I'm trying to force myself to be silent because we can carry it on and on. We need to have a little bit break. You feel free to bring your drink and your afternoon tea over to this room, and then we have 10 minutes break, then we come back for the next session, please. Thanks.